In the darkest days of the civil rights era, militant racists sought to destroy the movement. Their tactic was terror.
I still wake up hearing those screams. I still wake up at times seeing fire.
Foot soldiers in the battle for equality were assassinated.
I saw him lying there and screamed.
Children were sacrificed because of the color of their skin.
That picture of Emitt shows us the ugliness of racism.
Those who died in domestic wars.
An August Mississippi night in 1955, an old shack juts out of a cotton field like a blister, as the air is electric with the ceaseless drone of insects. 14-year-old Emitt Till is in bed, restless from the heat and humidity. A truck drives up a dusty road. Two white men get out and enter the house. Inside, the owner of the shack, Emitt's granduncle, 64-year-old Mose Wright, protests. But the two men roust the boy out of bed and force him into their truck. Emitt Till is on a journey from which he will never return. Till had come out a week earlier from Chicago, where he'd lived a quiet life with his mother, Mamie. Though some accounts characterize the boy as a prankster, a risk-taker, his mother disagrees.
He was a good boy, and when he wasn't looking after me and the things around the house, we had about 3 or 4 older people in the neighborhood that he saw to religiously.
Till left Chicago in August of 1955 to spend the summer with his favorite cousins in Money, Mississippi. Population, 55. He'd been warned by his mother that things were different in the South.
I told him to be sure to say yes, sir, and no, sir. That was one of the first things I told him. And then I told him, I said, if you meet a white woman, you do not look at her. You drop your head. I said, if necessary, you step off the sidewalk and let her pass.
His mother's warning was prophetic, for it was an encounter with a white woman in a general store one afternoon that would prove fatal to Emitt Till. By some accounts, Emitt had walked out of the store and said bye, baby, to Carolyn Bryant, the shopkeeper. From a modern perspective, the incident may seem like nothing. But in the context of that time in the South, it was a potent incident that touched on racial and sexual taboos. Whatever Emitt Till's momentary indiscretion was, he might as well have lit a bonfire. Ever since the end of the Civil War, despite gaining their freedom from slavery, blacks had been decreed second-class citizens in the South. Segregation wasn't just a way of life, it was the law of the land. The so-called Jim Crow laws created a state-sanctioned racial caste system.
Jim Crow laws is the name that came to apply to those laws, which was passed after Reconstruction when whites began to take back political power in the South. And they passed laws that forbid a black person, for example, to go to white schools, to ride on the bus without sitting in the back. Any number of laws that basically codified or made illegal for black people to exercise right that white people had.
But in 1954, 1 year before the Till incident, the Supreme Court, in the historic Brown versus Topeka Board of Education ruling, made it illegal for school systems to segregate blacks. It set the South simmering.
They want to throw white children and colored children into the melting pot of integration, out of which will come a conglomerated, mulatto, mongrel class of people.
There was a great fear put in white people by really the intellectual establishment of the South through its newspapers and speeches of its leaders, that if blacks integrate our society, they're only going to be interested in white women.
The South sought to cling to the traditions it had held in its glory days. Any change to that way of life made many Southern whites angry. No black would be allowed to cross the color line. So when the townspeople of Money, Mississippi perceived that Emitt Till had crossed that line at the expense of the dignity of a white woman, it sealed his fate. After being abducted from his uncle's home, Till was taken by Carolyn Bryant's husband, Roy, and his brother-in-law, J.W. Millam, to a remote shack. Emitt Till died a horrible death. He was beaten so badly, his head was crushed. One eye was gouged out. He was shot in the head. To the Southern establishment that lorded over its black citizens, Till's death at first had no impact.
They considered his death as basically nothing. And you have to consider that in Mississippi and in the South in these days, the deaths of black Americans did not merit news.
The possibility of a trial or a conviction was also a non-issue.
The history of Mississippi, and I'd say in general in the South, was that no whites had ever been convicted for killing blacks.
It is in that setting that he was killed with a degree of permissiveness. But that is how grotesque, how sick the country was at that time.
Within days of his death, Emitt Till's body was found at the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. It was wired to the 75-pound fan to keep it from floating up. When his remains were sent back to Chicago, his mother was torn apart with grief. But the wooden box that held his body had been nailed shut. There were instructions from the Mississippi coroner that under no circumstances was it to be unsealed. But this was Chicago, and Emmett's mother demanded to see her son one last time. After seeing what was left of her son, Mamie insisted on an open casket funeral.
I wanted the world to look in and see. And so that's when I decided to let the world come in and see, because it was something that I could not handle alone.
There were many people lynched and assassinated, but something about the Emitt Till killing, maybe that something was the way people were able to see it all around the nation.
America could no longer pretend that lynchings, the vigilante murders of blacks, were an acceptable or inevitable fact of life. In the post-Civil War era, there had been thousands of lynchings. Emitt Till's death underscored 2 points: that things had to change, but also there'd be blood spilled on the way.
That picture of Emitt shows us the ugliness of racism. And because the world was able to see Emitt in that state, that brought on what we call the modern civil rights movement.
The Southern newspapers said all the right things, that Till's murder was brutal and senseless, and that the people of Mississippi deplored this brutal act. And yet, when Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam were arrested in order to stand trial, some of those white Southerners who were shocked would find a way to take care of their own. In 1955, J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant were charged with the brutal slaying of Emitt Till in Money, Mississippi. As America pointed an accusing finger at the South, white Mississippians who'd previously decried the killing now circled their wagons. They raised $10,000 for the accused legal expenses, and 5 local lawyers volunteered to defend them. During their testimony, Millam and Bryant brazenly admitted to kidnapping and beating the boy, and yet the all-white jury deliberated for just 1 hour and acquitted them of murder. In 1955, This was the way justice was meted out in the South.
The white power structure of the South, in effect, endorsed their activities by not prosecuting them when they committed crimes, or if whites sat on juries, they simply nullify the evidence. Just end up with find them not guilty. So they felt they had a license to kill.
Sometime after the acquittal, Millam sold his story to Look magazine. He admitted to an interviewer that he and Bryant had in fact shot Till in the head. But Emitt Till's death would not go down as just another lynching.
People didn't forget it. It had just a galvanizing effect, particularly on the black population.
Dr. King would often say, honor and suffering is redemptive, and there's power in the innocent blood. The innocent blood of Emitt Till exploded and hit the national consciousness in ways that was irreversible.